Hi, Dr. Bloom. My name is Jacobie Backstrom. I'm extremely excited about having this conversation with you about grade retention and what that ultimately meant. One of the things that I've learned about this is that it was a pretty political process, right? And although there was good intentions in specific acts and specific philosophies, it really affected people. This topic is very controversial because there are people who believe in grade retention and there are people who don't believe in it. It reminds me of myself. I never experienced being held behind in a grade level, but I did experience the pressures of standardized tests and, of course, the No Child Left Behind Act. So in this conversation, we will be having some information. We will be discussing some of those things and what did that mean? So that is a good question. So grade retention is the practice in which children are required to repeat a grade level in school because they failed to meet required benchmarks or grade level and standards. So just imagine that 17-year-old, that 15-year-old child, that 15-year-old child that is supposed to be in the ninth grade, but because he did not meet academic standards or he didn't meet the expectation of the grade level requirements, he was left behind and he's still in the seventh grade. You know, this is important. This is interesting because just imagine the mental, physical, emotional trauma that student is going through. Just imagine how he's not able to relate to the kids in his classroom because they are younger than him. And I do believe that there was a time in American history where there was a decrease in, an increase in students being left behind. Republican President George W. Bush in 2002 implemented the No Child Left Behind Act. This was an interesting act because on a macro level, it allowed for the nation to see the performance level of all Americans. They were able to see that whites and Asians were doing good in the Englishes and in the maths, whereas African Americans and Latino individuals were doing significant gains in specific subjects, right? But this was a lot of pressure. This was the implementation of standardized testing, where the implementation of high pressuring standardized testing, where it held people accountable. It held the schools accountable. It held the teachers accountable. The teachers, and it was under the, how can I say this? It was under the expectation that the student, the teacher, had great impact on the student, right? And their jobs, if the student didn't do well, then that means the teachers weren't doing their jobs. And if the teachers weren't doing that job, that means the school wasn't doing what they were supposed to do. Because not only was the standardized test in place to measure the students' academic performance, but it was put into place to compare the schools to other schools and states to other states. And if there were schools who did well, better, because they were graded, if they did better than other schools, they would be rewarded. So standardized testing was the vehicle chosen to measure, get this, chosen to measure the progress of these students annually. In tracking this, the federal government was able to see whether schools were meeting their proficiency goals. A major portion of the No Child Left Behind Act that is required by all public schools. Now, being a part of the No Child Left Behind Act, because I was the class of 2012, which just imagine how we were being pressured because we were told that if we didn't pass this test, we were going to fail. It was fear of failing embedded into us. And as a student, I could just imagine, because I wasn't good at standardized testing. That's all we did in classes were just thinking about how we were strategizing, even the teacher was strategizing, what can I teach you in order for you to get this? Because the teachers didn't know what was on that standardized test. So just imagine how she was feeling. Her job is on the line. And what about the principals? I never thought about the principals, right? So everyone was pressured. And you know what the crazy part of this is? It's that sign on the wall for me. It's the fact that the culture of the joy of education, of learning, you still have to maintain that culture. Although you are being pressured and your job is being put on the line because of this type of implementation. So, and yes, it does sound pressuring, right? Because the teachers were being held accountable, not just the students. The only people that was holding the students accountable was the teachers, right? So yes, it was equality present because there was a standardized test that went over the same content, the same information, tested the student on nothing different, right? So Albert Einstein said this: everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So there's a popular argument, I want to read it, I thought it was very interesting. It says a popular argument for standardized testing is that it's inclusive and non-discriminatory because the content is the same for all test takers, regardless of gender, race, or socioeconomic background. However, as mentioned in Time magazine article by Cornell University associate Professor Rooks, Black and Latino students in New York score below whites and Asians on standardized tests. If we take this information and couple it with the argument that standardized tests are inclusive and non-discriminatory, it would lead to the conclusion that Latino and Black students are a whole lot less knowledgeable than their white and Asian classmates. A statement that is not only racist, but completely false. You know why it's completely false? Because although it is equally equal, right? It's not. It's still racist. It's still discriminatory because it's a certain specific race. The data shows that this race, this specific category of students have not been performing well. So why would you give them a test to prove that? In efforts to think that they're gonna pass this. To say that standardized tests are inclusive and non-discriminatory is simply an invalid argument that can be disproven using the scores provided by the test agencies, data, as well as data collected about comparing socioeconomic status, data, and performance on the test, data. So equity, even though equality is present, equity is not present. This means that the fish, the elephant, and the dog is not provided with the proper amount of accommodations and resources and tools for them to be successful. In education and social structures, equity refers to the fact that different people have varying needs of support and assistance. This means that proper systems have to be put in place in order for them to be successful. Equity and equality. So just imagine what the student was going through, which that is a good question. Shame. Learners could feel their workers will never be as good as others. Their work will never be good as others. Fear of failure. I can relate to that. Low self-esteem. Emotionally sensitive, adjusting to change. I'm not a good test taker. I could only imagine what I was going through. I was so discouraged. Like, I know I'm not going to pass this test, right? And it doesn't measure my ability of how knowledgeable I am. It's the fact that I'm not a good test taker. I am a dog trying to climb a tree. Are you kidding me? Where there's a monkey who can blatantly climb that tree way better than I can. I need some chairs. So what was the perception? So just imagine these students going through the No Child Left Behind Act standardized test, because that's what I grew up with, right? I did that, took tests. You know, we're taught, we're programmed a certain way. So should I, A, leave my resume, B, wait for an interview, C, try again later, D, all of the above? Just imagine if we think like that and we don't know it. And then here's a lady right here that says, another No Child Left Behind graduate to see you. She describes it as if we're a generation. I'm actually offended by this. I'm actually offended by this because it's interesting how people thought about us and probably still think about us. So in 2015, President Barack Obama, who's a Democrat, did another bipartisan decision and did the Every Student Succeeds Act. This was interesting because this addressed equity, okay? Provides less pressure on the standardized testing, and, you know, again, the system's not perfect, but it clearly defines everything. It gave the All Kids Matter theme, right? The kids matter, but we have to put the proper tools and resources for them to be successful, in place for them to be successful. So the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 ensures that all kids matter. It includes serious protection for vulnerable students, and it creates important leverages for parents, communities, and advocates to continue their push for equity and accountability for all students. So on the macro level, consistent state adopted standards for all children that are aligned with the demands of post-secondary education and work. Some of the things that stood out to me on the meso level, dealing with the population between the macro and the micro, is that annual statewide assessment to provide objectives and comparable data on how all students are performing, statewide accountability systems that include gap closing goals for student outcomes, rating based on the progress of all students in each group of students, and the expectation of action when any group of students is consistently underperforming. And then you have a rich public reporting and outcome and opportunities to learn for all groups of children, including per pupil expenditures, access to rigorous coursework, and measures of school climate. And then on the micro level, attending to and commitment to address inequities and access to ineffective out-of-field and experienced teachers, and then providing the monetary, the investment in resources for the highest poverty schools so that students can be successful. It's not just about access. It's about equitable access. I believe in that. I believe that to the fullest extent. We talked about Horace Mann, who was definitely a great thinker back in the day for education. Horace Mann believed that education, then and beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the condition of men. And I believe that to be true too as well. But education can't be, well, I'll say this, education, I believe, can value add to a community, can value add to an individual, a person's family. But if we don't give equitable access to people, if we don't provide the tools and the resources and the accommodations and the modifications and the edits and all this other stuff, we don't continue to go back to the drawing board to reevaluate these things, education can't be the great equalizer. Thank you for joining me in this discussion. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for listening.